Volume 1 of Letterman Linen's collective works. Beautiful. Oh, we gotta start. How many pages is this? Oh, about 500. It's not the same thing. Yep, thought so. Thank you. All right, everybody. Let's close it down and let's start reading. And bear with me on the reading. I read at least 3 hours a day. So there is little information about the fate of these early Pueblo captives, but 2 points are worth emphasizing. First, they were expensive. Onet's nephew and subsidiary captain Vincent D. Zandovra received dozens of Acoma indigenous people, but according to Zeldervar's disposition, 60 of them subsequently ran away. Zeldera estimate his losses at more than 10,000 pesos, which works out to a little more than 160 pesos per slave. This sum of money is greater than the value of a stone house in Mexico City or Annette's earlier salary as governor. Second, even though these slaves were potentially very valuable, in order to turn them into real money, one had to transport them into New Mexico, and sell them in more southerly markets for small pieces of silver and other forms of liquid payment were in circulation. According to Onate, at least 45 Spanish soldiers and officers, quote, in anger at not finding bars of silver on the ground right away, end quote, left New Mexico taking slaves with them. Even Onate and his nephew Zandalavar were accused of transporting slaves all the way to Mexico City. Although they were later acquitted of this charge, traffickers had to set aside wagons to transport the slaves, and had to go through the trouble of the expense of feeding them for months along the way. They did it because they knew that in the end they would still make a profit. Governor Onate set an enduring precedent in this line of business. A long list of New Mexican governors right up to the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 were not only tolerant of complicit in the trafficking of indigenous people, but they were directly and actively involved in this human trade. Instance of 17th century officials implicated in the traffic of New Mexican indigenous slaves are too numerous to recount here. However, a few vignettes point to some of the milestone in the development of indigenous slave trade. Governor Juan D. Alate, 1618 to 1625, for example, was the first to issue veils of small pieces of paper authorizing the bearer to seize an orphaned girl or boy. And once they get their veils, one witness recalls, the soldiers go to the pueblos and take the orphans and keep them in their homes as if they were black slaves. One fair averred that such children were treated as if they were, quote, yearling calves or colts, while another resident observed that often they were not orphans at all, but children forcibly taken away from their parents, like they do now, still to this day. Oops, get back up there. At the end of this term, Governor Alate traveled to New Mexico, where he was arrested for illegally transporting indigenous people out of New Mexico. Governor Felipe Sotola or Osiro, 1625 to 1629, spearheaded the use of indigenous auxiliaries to conduct slaving raids. This innovation was fully on display when the group of Vancouver Apaches entered the Spanish town of Santa Fe, asking to see, quote, the Mother of God. The object of the indigenous people's curiosity, was the statue of the Virgin Mary known as the La Conquistadora, which had been brought from Spain in 1625. They were led into a crude chapel that harbored the figure, which was carved of solid willow and adorned with a crimson garment covered with golden leaves and arabesques. The leaders of the visiting indigenous peoples, an elderly man, was so impressed that, quote, speaking with great devotion, he declared his intention to become a Christian. What occurred next, however, was hardly edifying. After the Vaquero Apache departed, Governor Santolo Asiro sent for the gusty indigenous captain, end quote, a declared enemy of the visitor, and commanded him and his posse to, quote, bring back whomever they could catch, end quote. They did as they were told, overtaking the indigenous people, killing the elderly chief, who was still wearing a rosary around his neck, and bringing a number of captives back to Santa Fe. As one farer summoned up said, this sad episode, the Vaquero Apaches had been on the brink of converting, quote, but the devil had recourse to one of his whales, choosing as his instrument the greed of our governor, end quote. Governor Luis de la Rosa, 1637 to 1641, experimented with the use of slaves within New Mexico to manufacture goods for exports to Parral. He set up an auberge, or textile sweatshop in Santa Fe, where he kept some 30 indigenous people locked up. These indigenous people seized in unjust wars, quote unquote, according to one resident, made stockings and other woolen items and painted mantessas, cloths, with charcoal. Governor Rosa was a hands-on owner. He would be frequently found at the shop, covered with charcoal, quote, and one could tell him apart from the indigenous peoples only by his fine clothes, end quotes. Working conditions in the auberges all over Mexico ranged from bad to appalling, and those in New Mexico were no different. Although some of Governor Rosa's indigenous peoples died of starvation, the governor had the good business sense to replace them by expanding the Spaniards' war with the Apaches and the Utes, but calling for unprovoked attacks. Thank you. By calling for unprovoked attacks, the indigenous peoples, Governor Rosa initiated a cycle of reprisals and counter reprisals that resulted in ideal conditions for obtaining indigenous workers, some of whom ended their days in his textile shop. We have seen that the demand for indigenous slaves increased remarkably in the wake of the indigenous rebellions from Parral in the 1650s. Governor Juan Masso, M-A-S-O, 1656 to 1659, rose to the occasion. This frontier entrepreneur took his predecessors' policies to the next logical level by issuing a, quote, definitive death sentence against the entire Apache nations and others of the same ilk. In other words, they declare open seasons on all Apache and their allies. At the same time, Governor Manasso devised a legal framework of bypassing the Crown's prohibition against indigenous slavery. He gave out certificates that entitled the bearers to keep Apaches in deposit, quote unquote, not as slave, for the specific number of years. Quote, the Apaches have been irreducible enemy of our Catholic faith and of all Christians of this kingdom. End quote. Read one of these certificates signed in Santa Fe on October 12th, 1658, quoting, "And by virtue of this sentence, they may be taken out of this kingdom, New Mexico, and kept in deposit for a period of 15 years, starting on the day when they reach 12 years of age, and at no time they would be able to come back to this kingdom." This particular certificate was issued by Sebastian, a 7-year-old boy with big black eyes and a face scarred by smallpox. We can get a good sense of Perel's gravitational pull on New Mexico in Governor Bernardo Lopez de Mendizábal's frantic preparation as he readied 9 wagons to depart for the mining center in the fall of 1659, as a first dispatch of squadrons to bring back, quote, heathen indigenous people to sell. They collected about 70 natives. Governor Mendizábal also sent orders to 6 pueblos in the Salinas area, quote, to carry salt on their shoulders and on their own animals for the distance up to 30 leagues, 90 miles without pay. A captain left a vivid description of Mendizábal's exertion in the letter worth quoting at length. And here he is quoted at length. This sending of salt to El Parral by the governor is injurious, sir, because to equip his wagon with some degree of safety, he forthwith sent the accolades, mayoras, higher magistrates, who are people of ordinary sort, only concerned with promoting their own interests. To some of the pueblos, to take away from the natives were grass mats, which were the only beds they had, giving them nothing in exchange. For others, they took their bare skin and their tecas, T-E-C-O-A-S, which are pieces of dressed leather that they used for footwear. The Accolades used these things to cover their wagons. We have evidence that in the pueblo of Tawas alone, they took 40 buckskins without any pay whatsoever. Clearly, by the 1650s, the Kingdom of New Mexico had become little more than a supply center for Perel. From the preceding examples of many others, it is possible to reconstruct the overall trajectory of the traffic of natives from New Mexico. The earliest Spanish settlers began to enslave Pueblo indigenous people. Sorry, everybody. But they quickly discovered. Stop doing this. But they quickly discovered that keeping Pueblos as slaves was counterproductive, as this bred discount among the natives on which Spaniards depended for their very subsistence. Along the occasional enslavement of Pueblos continued through the 17th century. The colonialists gradually redirected their slaving activities to Apaches and Utes. The Spaniards injected themselves into the struggle between different rancheras, local bands, and exploited intergroup antagonisms to facilitate a supply of slaves, as Governor Sotelo Osiro did with the gusty indigenous captain. So they're doing the same thing. Let me repeat that. They caused inner conflicts. That's what they did to African people in Africa in their indigenous societies. They sharpened the antagonisms between each of them, causing for conflicts and causing for captives. Although New Mexican governors played the leading role in developing the slave trade and controlling the lion's share of the proceeds private entrepreneurs also gained a foothold in the businesses. Colonialists who owned encomendendas were able to extract unpaid labor from their Pueblo indigenous people and, as one witness admitted, occasionally send some of them away to be sold as slaves in New Spain, as was the practice. Spanish settlers without encomendans were at a clear disadvantage concerning the commercial opportunities of the silver economy, but they could still acquire indigenous captives, servants, whom they could sell in more southerly markets or keep in New Mexico to produce export goods. From the start, New Mexican colonialists possessed the extraordinarily high number of servants. Already in 1630, Santa Fe's minuscule white population of about 250 held around 700 servants and slaves. This is everything white man, woman, and child residing in the capital possessed between 2 to 3 native servants on average. These indigenous peoples, Pueblos, as well as Plains indigenous people, acquired through slave raids, toiled in sweatshops or private homes, weaving and decorating textiles, preparing hides, and harvesting pine nuts. Sounds like what we did to Africa. In growing numbers, redo it. That's all it is. Copy paste. The growing numbers of New Mexican indigenous peoples in Parral came by gleaning from baptismal records, which contain entries such as these, quote, Ennis baptized on April 16th, 1671, an indigenous girl from New Mexico of unknown parents, Cradez, and an ensign Lorenzo San Benigno, and Antonio baptized on May 7th, 1647, an Apache girl of unknown parents from the hacienda of Captain Andres del Herrero. Even though parish records refers to them as servants rather than slaves, everyone in Parral knew that they had been acquired in public auctions at the main plaza. The number of New Mexican slaves sent to Parral increased in the 1650s, continuing to expand in the 1660s, and reach record numbers in 1670s. By 1679, so many indigenous people were flowing out of New Mexico at the Bishop of Durango launched for formal investigation into this burgeoning business. Bishop Bartholomew Garcia de Escalanlan undertook as this inquest less out of the sense of moral and religious duties than out of concern about the church's declining revenues. Ordinarily, the faithful of Nueve Vizcaya, a province that included the modern state of Chihuahua, Durango, Sonora, and Sinaloa, had to pay a yearly tithe to the bishopric of 10% of their animals and crops. But ranchers all over this region discovered that they were able to reduce their herds and consequently their tax liabilities by trading tithe-bearing animals for indigenous slaves who were tax-free. In effect, the acquisition of indigenous peoples amounted to a tax shelter, and the amount of the shelter revenue was large enough that the tithes of the bishopric of Durango were declining. As Bishop S. Canula toured his enormous ecclesiastic district, he interviewed merchants and slave traffickers from New Mexico to learn more about the human traffic. One outspoken young man named Antonio Garcia explained that no merchant could leave New Mexico on his own because the indigenous peoples around El Paso del Norte were at war with the Spaniards. Quote, so then the governor sends his indigenous people and his merchandise to the bishopric of Nueva Vizcaya. He invites everyone to come together in a convoy. Garcia himself had joined the convoy in the fall of 1678. On that occasion, he had taken 3 indigenous girls and had received 15 or 16 mares for each of them. He was a small merchant compared with one of his traveling companions who had exchanged his human cargo for more than 1,000 cows. And the consequence of this trafficking were not long in coming. In the summer of 1680, the indigenous people of New Mexico launched a massive rebellion, which, as well as we will see in chapter 6, was motivated by a large extent by the growing indigenous slave trade. Beyond northern Mexico, coarse indigenous labor played a fundamental role in the mining economies of Central America and the Caribbean, Colombia, Venezuela, the Andean region, and Brazil. Yet the specific arrangements varied from place to place. Unlike Mexico's silver economy, scattered in multiple mining centers, the enormous mine of Potasso dwarfed all others in the Andes. To satisfy the labor needs of this mountain of silver, quote unquote, Spanish authorities instituted a gargantuan system of draft labor known as the Meta, which acquired that more than 200 indigenous communities span a large area of modern-day Peru and Bolivia, send one-seventh of their adult population to work in the mines of Postillo or Hanacavelesia and Calaloma. And any given year, 10,000 indigenous people or more had to take the turns working in the mines. This state-directed system began in 1573 and remained in operation for 250 years. Other mines in Latin America, such as gold and diamond fields of Brazil and the emerald mines of Colombia, depended more on inert prospectors and private forms of labor. But even though the degree of state involvement on the scale of these operations varied from place to place, they all relied on labor arrangements that ran the gamut from clear slave labor, African, indigenous, and occasionally Asian people, to semi-cohesive institutions of practices such as encomendas or repartimientos, debt peonage, and a milita of salaried work. Mines all across the hemisphere thus propelled the other slavery. Chapter 5. The Spanish Campaign. A century before the American and French Revolution, the Spanish crown set out to free the slaves around the world. They intended the beneficiaries were not Africans but indigenous peoples living in the far corners of the empire. And the leaders of this crusade were not fairy revolutionary, but a mystical king, his foreign-born queen, and their sickling son. This movement began with one of the least likely figures to get embroiled in the idealist quest. Philip IV was a worldly man fond of hunting, bullfighting, and the arts. Of all the Spanish monarchs, he stands as the most avid and discerning collector of patron and painters, beginning with his own court painter, the extraordinary Diego Vasquez. But Philip's true passion, like that of many of his contemporaries, was the theater. In his youth, he was a regular at the corrals or theaters of Madrid, enjoying the latest plays by the prolific Lupo de Vega, a cantankerous Francisco de Quevedo, or some other luminary of Spain, Salguero de Org or Golden Age. Since court etiquette prevented kings from going to the theater, Philip attended incognito, often wearing a mask. Plays were represented in the courtyards, surrounded by houses overlooking the stage. In one of these second-floor apartments, above the crush and din of the crown, the Spanish king was able to spend many pleasurable afternoons, taking in comedies or dramas without being noticed. These escapades also afforded Philip IV the opportunity to indulge his other great passions, women. At the Corral de la Cruz, he became smitten with a 16-year-old actress named Maria Inés Calderon, who took Madrid by storm with her sweet voice and captivating manner. After one of her performances, the king invited her to join him in his apartment, which caused the king's passion to grow even wilder. Thus began the intense but short-lived relationship. Philip had a son with Maria Inés and would go on to father more than 20 illegitimate children with so many women. Philip was not, however, just a pleasure seeker. Almost incorrigibly, he was also extremely religious. When in his 30s, he suffered a personal crisis that steered him towards mysticism. As a result, he sacked the man who had relied on to rule his enormous empire for more than 20 years, Count Duke of Olivares, and announced that he would henceforth govern using no intermediaries. Yo tomo el ramo. I take over the oar. He wrote to one of his governors. Philip summoned mystics from across Castile, who was regarded as the permanent mystic of her time. After a brief encounter, the two struck up in an extraordinary candid correspondence that would last for 22 years until the end of their lives of 1665. Through the more than 600 letters they exchanged, it is possible to peer into Philip's soul. Philip IV believed that God followed his every move and rewarded or punished the whole of the empire according to his conduct. He confided to Sorie Marie that his sexual appetite was the cause of Spain's misfortune. Quote, I secretly have any trust left. I scarcely have any trust left in myself because I have sinned a great deal and I deserve the punishment and affliction that I suffered. And the greatest gift I could receive is for God to punish me rather than these kingdoms. For I am the one to blame and not them who have always been true Catholics. End quote. As this contrite Philip sought to rule in a way that would please God, Sor Maria urged him to dispense, quote, true justice and stamp out vices and all matter of sin, end quote. Of the many matters that acquired Philip's attention, the enslavement of indigenous peoples in the New World was decidedly secondary. We do not know what Philip's personal view on the subject may have been, but during the early years of his reign, he favored the Iron Fist. The Kingdom of Chile, for instance, had experienced a massive indigenous insurrection at the close of the 16th century. The situation had been so critical that Philip's father, the predecessor of Philip III, had taken the drastic step in stripping the Mapuche indigenous peoples of the customary royal protection against enslavement in 1608, thus making Chile one of the few parts of the empire where slaves taken was entirely legal. Philip IV inherited this morass when he ascended to the throne and could have done something to improve relations. Instead, in 1625, 4 years into his reign, the young monarch not only endorsed his father's policy, but made them even harsher by ordering, quote, an offensive war in the same way that is used to be waged before the king or lord, and my father, may his soul rest in peace, stop it and made it defensive only. And in particular, you will make sure that all indigenous captured in the war will be distributed as slaves, end quote. Under Philip's pointed direction, the traffic of indigenous peoples flourished in Chile for decades. Yet in the twilight of his life, Philip came to grips with the failures of his policies as he struggled to save his soul. In 1655, after 30 years of insurrection, the Mapuches launched another attack, making clear that conflict was not close to an end. Philip's offensive war had produced not a Spanish victory and a durable peace, but a perpetual state of warfare kept going by slave takers and owners of indigenous slaves, who were its chief beneficiaries. So the monarch and his ministers changed course. The crown's policy towards the natives of Chile became markedly softer. In 1656, Philip issued a strongly worded order prohibiting the so-called esclavandi de la Anzuzi, a customary slavery in which native peoples willingly sold family members. In 1660, he curtailed textile sweatshops with their notorious use for their using indigenous slaves. And in 1662, he issued no less than 3 royal orders forbidding the trafficking of Chilean indigenous people to Peru. That same year, Philip requested a reassessment of the imperial policies in Chile, and expressing his belief that slaves taken had become the main obstacle of peace with the Mapuche indigenous peoples. Philip's opinion had changed much since the confident years of his youth. Yet the king died before he could set the indigenous people of Chile free and discharge his royal consciousness. But Philip was not alone in trying to make things right. His wife, Marina, was 30 years younger than he, every bit as pious and far more determined. The crusade to free the indigenous people of Chile and those in the empire at large gained the momentum during Queen Mariana's regence from 1665 to 1675. The culminated in the reign of her son Charles II, alarmed by reports of large slaving grounds on the periphery of the Spanish Empire. They used the power of an absolute monarchy to bring about the immediate liberation of all indigenous slaves. Mother and son took a deeply entrenched slaving interest, depriving the empire of much needed revenue, and risked the very sensibility of distant provinces to advance their humanitarian agenda. They waged a war against indigenous bondage. I just lost my place. Hold on. I'm going to reread this. Alarmed by the reports of the large slaving grounds on the peripheries of the Spanish Empire, they used the power of the absolute monarch to bring about the immediate liberation of all indigenous slaves. Mother and son took a deeply entrenched slaving interest, depriving the empire of much needed revenue and risking the very stability of distant provinces to advance their humanitarian agenda. They waged a war against indigenous bondage that raged as far as the island of the Philippines, and the forest of Chile, the Alnenos grasslands of Colombia and Venezuela, and the deserts of Chihuahua and New Mexico. Yet both were exceedingly unlikely emancipators. Maria, I think it's Marina, was an Austrian by birth, who had arrived in Spain when she was 15 years old to be betrothed but to the aging Philip, because she was originally a foreigner, a great deal younger than her late husband. Some authors have depicted Queen Mariana as a weak ruler operating in the world of influential men. The fact ran contrary to this view, however, as she was notoriously strong-willed. As one scholar of the Spanish court put it, her commendable fixity of ideas sometimes degenerated into obstinacy of her liable code of conduct, into stubbornness, end quote. If anything, she could be faulted for attempting to extend her power beyond her regents and into her son's reign. King Charles II was as even more improbable champion of indigenous rights. Carlos was only 3 when his father Philip IV died, and already showing signs that something was wrong with him. Quote, "He seems extremely weak, with pale cheeks, and even in every open mouth, a symptom, according to the unanimous opinion of doctors, of some gastric upset," end quote, wrote a French diplomat. Quote, "And though they say he walks on his own feet, and that the cords with which the manana made guides him are simply in case he makes a false step, I doubt it, since I saw him taking his nurse's hands to hold himself up when they retired. Carlos grew to be a listless adolescent. He walked slowly alongside walls or tables to steady himself and showed little interest in his surroundings. Few believed that he was possessed an independent will. His physical and mental traits led his subjects to refer to him as El Hanchezado, the Bewitched. The main order and decrees that have come down to us illuminate Queen Marian's and the King and then King Charles' determination to protect the indigenous peoples. They speak of the gravity of the matter of indigenous slavery and the scruples of conscience that their enslavement causes. Marina often referred back to Philip's precedents, revealing a widow's desire to bring to fruition a project cut short by death. Something similar is true of Charles. In his most important decree, freeing all the slaves of the American continent, he devoted admiring words to his mother's efforts. There was a family enterprise passed from one member to the next. Perhaps the great mystic of Agrande lurked behind their family's resolve. Philip became deeply impressed by Sor Maria's earnest injunctions to rule in a Christian spirit by fighting oppression and providing justice, notions that extended so naturally to his indigenous subjects. Moreover, there had been an episode of Sor Maria's past of connecting her directly to the indigenous peoples. Back in the early 1620s, when Philip was busy prosecuting the war against the indigenous peoples of Chile, Sor Maria was gaining renown for her trance. During this spell, and without ever leaving her room in Angranda, she traveled to the Americas, cloaked in blue. She also appeared to the indigenous people of New Mexico and Texas, preaching the gospel and urging them to accept the holy water of baptism. Fuck you. Soraya Marie herself could not tell whether she had actually bilocated, that is, had been in Europe and in America at the same time, or as she would later be more inclined to think, it had been, quote, an angel of my shape that appeared there and preached and taught them. And over here, the Lord showed me what was happening. A bunch of white saviors. But the fact was that many natives of New Mexico had witnessed multiple aspirations of the white nuns. Farrers reported meeting indigenous people who had never been in contact with the Spanish, but already knew the rudiments of the Catholic faith. When asked how they knew, they had simply replied, quote, the lady in blue, end quote. This is how Soraya Marie's first came to Philip's attention and how their paths began to converge. In their correspondence, neither Soraya Marie nor Philip wrote a single word about this episode. It was just too sensitive a subject, and the letter could fall into the wrong hands. At least on 2 occasions, the Inquisition investigated the nun's claims, and Philip probably used his influence to protect her. Yet Soraya Marie's unique connection to the New World and its peoples must have impressed not only Philip, but his successor as well. Queen Marina corresponded with the mystic of Angreda. And after Maria's death in 1665, Marina supported her canonization. Charles II was no less devoted. In 1677, during the thick of his anti-slavery campaign, he made a point to visit Angreda to honor Soraya Maria's legacy and perhaps to gain some strength and guidance of the difficult road ahead. They sound like a bunch of white saviors. I swear to God, they just sound like a bunch of white saviors. We're gonna go in there and save them. And no, dude, stop doing this shit. The empires of slaves. The Spanish anti-slavery crusade generated letters, testimonies, and reports about slaving grounds of the empire. 1,200 pages of campaigns related documents from northern Mexico, 1,000 for the Philippines, 300 for southern Chile, and decreasing amount for Argentina, the coast of Colombia and Venezuela, and other places. The sources of these documents reveal a great deal about the geography of native bondage. In the earlier days of conquest, European slavers were attracted to some of the most heavily populated areas of the New World, including the large Caribbean islands, Guatemala, and central Mexico. But at the time the anti-slavery crusade got underway in the 1660s, nearly 2 centuries after the discovery of America, the slaving grounds had shifted to remote frontiers where there were much lower population destinies, but where imperial control remained minimal or non-existent, and the constant war yielded steady streams of captives. 5 major slaving grounds are evident in the documentation of the anti-slavery crusade of the 17th century. The most daunting and morally fraught was in Chile, where slaves taken had remained legal between 1608 and 1674. With the crown's explicit permission, slavery had flourished there, and Spanish chaplain who had lived in Chile for 30 years, 15 of those among the Mapuche indigenous peoples, penned in a clear-eyed report of Queen Marina, describing how Spanish captains lured the indigenous peoples with false promises of friendship, asking them to come and to appointed places with their families and animals. In some instances, the indigenous people were in the process of preparing a meal to celebrate and formalize their alliances with the Europeans, and they were mercilessly attacked and taken prisoners. These were not vague accusations, but precise reports including names and numbers. Quote, the Conquets, Catalab was killed with spears, and they took 17 captives from him, end quote. Or the Conquet, Akanyako fell dead there, and he had brought 12 family members with him, and they took all of them. By the chaplain's court count, one raid in 1672 netted 87 captives and another 274. In previous years, he had reported slaving raids resulting in 300 to 400 captives. Quote, and I could describe many other unjust raids and abusive deaths in the past, end quote. Governor Juan Enriquez affirmed categorically in 1676 that in Chile, there are many more indigenous slaves than Spaniards, end quote. An estimate that, even if halfway accurate, would put their number to tens of thousands. Slaves were so plentiful that merchants also shipped them to Peru. Their cities and mines were perennially in short supply of laborers. Indigenous peoples branded on the face arrived, quote, in great numbers, end quote, at port of Callao, a gateway to Lima, Lima, quote, where they were all thrown out into the plaza, and some were sold, and others only shown. Okay. Across the Andes, a second major slave zone extended through the province of Paraguay, on Tucumán, and the adjacent areas. In the 1660s and 1670s, Spanish slavers staged raids in Calchuqua Valley, and an area in Tucumán, of stunning rock formations and forbidden gorges, where various indigenous groups had coexisted since pre-contact times and were now being hunted down and shipped throughout the Rio de la Plata basin. The Spaniards were not the only ones raiding in this area. From the coast of Brazil, small parties of bandenterins, a cross between pathfinders, prospectors, and slavers, also mounted devastating expeditions into the interior. Over the centuries, Brazilians have celebrated the Bandeirantes in the poem, novel, and sculptures, hailed them as the founders of the nation. Yet the Bandeirantes took upward of 60,000 captives. Wow. 6,000 captives in the middle decades of the 17th century, snatching mostly indigenous people congregated in the Jesuit mission in Paraguay, the Llanos of Colombia and Venezuela, the vast grassland crisscrossed by tributaries of the Orinoco River, were a third zone of enslavement. Here, Spanish traffickers completed with English, French, and above all, Dutch networks of enslavement, all of which operated in the Llanos. I think it's Ilanos. I'm not sure. It might be II. It looks like it might be LL. I don't know. Looks like it's I. It looks like L. I don't know. Increasingly, the Carib indigenous people, whom the Spaniards had long sought to exterminate, emerged as the preeminent suppliers of slaves to all of these European competitors of the Spanish. The Caribs carried out raids at night, surrounding entire villages and carrying off children. A Spanish report summed up these activities. Quote, it will not be too much to say that the Caribs sell yearly more than 300 children, leaving murdered and in their houses more than 400 adults for the Dutch do not like to buy the latter because they will know that being grown up, they will escape. End quote. The victims of this trade could variously wind up in Spanish haciendas in Trinidad, the English plantation of Jamaica, the Dutch towns in Guyana, or as far west as Quanto, Ecuador, where some of them toiled in the textile sweatshops for which this city was famous. The four major slaving grounds laid in northern Mexico. Quote, there is nothing more forbidden since the beginning of the conquest than indigenous slavery. End quote. Pithily began a report that Queen Marina received from the members of the hacienda of, the Guadalajara. Can't say it. And yet, it is very common to see slaves being sold and held in those provinces, especially the Chichimex and the Sinaloa, New Mexico and Nuevo Leon. As we have seen this large and internally fragmented slaving area supplied laborers to the ranchers, silver mines in towns of northern Mexico and as far south as Mexico City. The last major areas of enslavement, and perhaps the largest, was the Philippines. The Philippines, where Europeans had stumbled on a dazzling world of slaves. Some are captured in wars that different villages waged against each other, wrote Guido de Lavezaras 7 years after the Spanish had first settled in the Philippines. Quote, some are slaves from birth and their origins is not known because their fathers, grandfathers, and ancestors were also slaves, and others become enslaved, quote, on account of minor aggressions regarding some of their rites and ceremonies, or for not coming quickly enough at the summons of a chief or some other such thing. Traffickers also targeted Muslim-dominated islands in the southern part of the archipelago, such as Mandanao or the Jalo, or the, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can say this, the dark-skinned, I can't say those, black people. I think it's black people or people of color, equivalent to sub-Saharan Africans in the eyes of many slavers who inhabited the islands of black people. They use the N-word, or I don't know if I can say these words, Panay and Cabu. A variety of slaves were offered in the markets of Manila, and many were transported across the Pacific on the Spanish galleons bound for Mexico and delivered to their owners there. Slavery was not new in these 5 major regions of enslavement. All of them possessed traditions of indigenous bondage harkening back to pre-contact times. Yet with the arrivals of white colonialists, these very traditions of captivity were subsumed under the blanket term esclavitude or slavery. Highly ritualized, idiosyncratic, and regional practice of bondage gradually became adapted to suit the needs of white colonialists. Thus, the traffic of natives became commodified and expanded geographically. Apaches from New Mexico were sold as far south as central Mexico and eventually into the Caribbean. Mapuches were from southern Chile, accustomed to cold and temperate climates, were marched to the port of Valparaiso and transported by ship to the scorching coastal plains of Peru. the Filipinos across the Pacific Ocean to reach their final destination in America. Sorry. These forces, this forced migration spanning hundreds or even thousands of miles, and the slaving networks had made much long-distance transactions possible were unthinkable before the arrival of Europeans, freeing the indigenous peoples. The start of the Spanish anti-slavery crusade cannot be dated with precision. It began somewhat nebulously as Philip addressed the insurrections of Chile in 1655 and attempted to clear his royal consciousness by issuing a draft of orders curtailing the enslavement of indigenous people. But the allied king approach, the alien king's approach was gradualist, and the pace too slow. His correspondence with viceroy governors and bishops stretched over months and years and dragged on until his death of 1665. Queen Marina brought renewed energy to the abolitionist crusade. If we had to choose an open salveo, I gotta do a puzzle piece. Salveo, it would be the Queen's 1667 order freeing all Chilean indigenous people who had been taken to Peru. Her orders was published in the Plaza of Leme and acquired all Peruvian slave owners to, quote, turn their indigenous slaves loose at the first opportunity. When the Viceroy of Peru learned of this order, he could not hide his disbelief. He praised, quote, the royal clemency of Her Majesty, but went on to write a long letter explaining, quote, the dire consequences, end quote, of an order that would reignite the war in Chile and allow the free indigenous people to, quote, go back to their rituals and preserve their ferocious character. Oh God. The Viceroy letter conveyed the unmistakable sense that the Queen was a well-meaning lady, but completely unaware of the realities of the New World. As she gained experience and confidence, Maria became bolder. In 1672, she freed the indigenous slaves of Mexico, irrespective of their provenance or the circumstances of their enslavement. Her decree of emancipation fell like a thunderbolt on a clear day, as well as we shall see later in this chapter. 2 years later, Marina seized on an unexpected message from the outside to strike again. In October 1674, the Papal Naku to Spain wrote that, quote, the groans of the poor indigenous peoples of Chile, who have been reduced to a miserable slavery with various pretexts by political and military authorities of that kingdom, have reached the ears of the Holy Father, end quote. He wondered why slavery persisted in Chile, quote, in spite of the many and repeated edicts of the most powerful king, predecessors of our Majesty, and of the orders of the Holy Faith. Marina and her counselors waited only a few weeks to respond, banning all forms of slavery in Chile. They extended the same prohibition to the Calchaquí Valley on the other side of the Andes. The campaign to liberate the indigenous people had kicked into high gear. With the accessions of Charles II to the throne in 1675, the anti-slavery crusade neared its culmination. In 1676, Charles set free the indigenous slaves of the Andean of Santo Domingo, comprised not only the Caribbean islands, but some coastal areas as well, and Paraguay. Finally, on June 12, 1679, he issued a decree of continental scope, quote, no indigenous people of my western Indies, islands, and mainland of the ocean sea under any circumstances or pretext, can be held as slaves. Instead, they will be treated as my vassals who have contributed so much to the greatness of my dominions, and I will remain very vigilant and careful, because this is a very grave matter. End quote. In a separate order issued on the same day, El Halchenzado freed the slaves of the Philippines, thus completing the project initiated by his father and mother, setting free all indigenous slaves within the Spanish Empire, and clear, if acknowledged, milestone in the long and checkered history of our human rights. The most detailed pronouncement of the Spanish monarch with respect to the enslavement of indigenous peoples appears in a monumental compilation of laws of the Spanish colonies known as the Recolecta de las Leyes de Indigenas, and an attempt at legal systematization that required decades of painstaking works before its publication in 1680. The section of the Ringcomplacano, is devoted to the freedom of indigenous peoples, emphatically prohibiting their enslavement under all circumstances, even if taken in just wars or ransom from other indigenous peoples. Unlike the French, the American Revolution of the late 18th century, however, the Spanish monarch did not arrive at the notion of, quote, self-evident or unalienable rights and applied in all cases at all times. Instead, considered each case on its own merit. They consented on occasion to the enslavement of some of their own recalcitrant subjects, and thus the Recompulations prohibited the enslavement of indigenous people, quote, except when expressly permitted in the same legal compendium, end quote. As it turned out, they excluded two groups from their broad royal protection: the inhabitants of the island of Mindanao in the Philippines, quote, who have taken up the sect of Mohammedan and are against our church and empire, and the Carib indigenous people who attack our settlement and eat human flesh, end quote. In principle, Philip and Marina and Charles were free to rule the colonies of the empires as they saw fit. They issued one decree after another, expecting prompt and dutiful compliance, as if they were changing everything with the scratch of the pen. We may doubt the efficacy of their method. The Spanish monarchs themselves were not so naive as to think that this would happen in every case, but their direct orders did carry enormous weight. In Trinidad, for example, the governor Sebastian del Ratata wrote to King Charles, quote, after several pleas and predictions of the utter destruction of this island, it is of its poverty and of the benefit of indigenous people themselves, who are much better off enslaved than eaten by the Carib indigenous people, and disregarding the accidents and dangers that I face on account of such great novelty, my resolve was to comply entirely with your Majesty's royal orders. Governor Rototi requested that all residents of the capital city of San Jose del Arena, as well as those of other outlying settlements, bringing their indigenous people to the governor's house. Failing to report each slave would be punished within a fine of 100 pesos, roughly the market value of an indigenous person. Rotata then compiled a list of all the slaves turned over and recorded each one's name, age, place of origin, and former masters before setting them free. He began the list with the 13 indigenous people who had served as domestic in his own household. Other prominent residents followed suit, Vicar Alonso del Lerme presented for indigenous peoples. Father Andreas del Norega gave up another 4. Sergeant Major Don Pedro Fernandez brought 10, and so on. In all, they surrendered 334 slaves. The brief biographical information contained in the slave list provides an inkling of the ravages of the slave trade in the Illinois. Diego, 20 of age, indigenous from the missions of Peretu in the province of Camuna, coast of Venezuela. Teresa, 25, Carib indigenous from the Carrara and the Orinoco River. Pedro, 22, indigenous from the Dutch town of Beatrice, Berapes, at the mouth of the Orinoco River. The vast majority said they had come from the town of Casanara, which was nothing but a crude port at the mouth of the Casanara River on the coast of Colombia, from which the slaves from the interior were shipped from Trinidad. Many of them were young children when they were enslaved and no longer remember the names of the towns and the communities of their parents. All of these natives found themselves suddenly and unexpectedly free. In addition to prying them loose from their masters, Governor Rotata made sure to wipe out their debts, saying that doing otherwise would have been, quote, an even greater burden than leaving them as slaves, as would happen upon the abolition of African slavery in the United States and Britain. Some indigenous slaves chose to stay with their former masters, but many decided to live independently. They were happy to receive plots of land at some distance from San Jose del Orina, where they attempted to remake their lives. This group consisted mostly of women and children in the miserable state, who could not understand one another, as they spoke different languages. Within a few months, however, they had built 30 or 40 shacks clustered into pueblos. Their fate is unknown. In other parts of the empire, the campaign generated excitement, but also tremendous opposition. In Mexico, Fernando del Herrero y Monterrey, a member of the Hacienda and the Guadalajara, became the moving spirit of the crusade. He publicized the Queen's anti-slavery decree. He heard complaints from mistreated indigenous people and wrestled with, quote, powerful personages over the issue of the personal service of the indigenous peoples. Nothing in Herrero y Montreso's history is a sober and conscientious lawyer would predict his anti-slavery ador. His persistent letter writing to governor and Alcalde's magistrates secured the release of close to 300 indigenous slaves, as well as 5 Chinese slaves from the Philippines and the Guadalajara. Furthermore, buoyed by these early victories, Herrera y Monterrey requested the expansion of the campaign. Quote, my actions are not enough if we do not do the same in the haciendas of Mexico and Guatemala. He wrote to Queen Marina, because these provinces, Sonora, New Mexico, and Nuevo Leon, are so large and the indigenous peoples have so little spirit that they are often sold into other jurisdictions. The Queen and the members of the Council of the Indies were only too glad to dispatch the necessary orders, while Herrero y Monterrey managed to manage the campaign from above. Lower levels officials fought a difficult public relations war in western and northern Mexico. In the province of Sinaloa, for instance, they fanned out into towns and villages to inform the public of the liberation orders. In San Felipe y Santiago, the provincial capital of Alcalandi, Miguel Calderon himself read out loud the royal decree on Sunday morning, immediately after the mass, as the throne was filing out of church. Quote, "From now on, all male and female indigenous people of this province are free." End quote. Over the next 3 weeks, the determined alcalde and his entourage visited the pueblos of Neo, Gosava, Tamazula, and others, informing them about Her Majesty's command and emphasizing both the Spanish and the Nahuatl through translators, that no soldiers or freres had the right to make indigenous people work without pay. Predictably, the campaign bred suspicion and hostility. The Jesuits of Sinaloa, for instance, felt unfairly accused of using their influence to build the crusade. Quote, "The indigenous people began to lose all sense of shame and became so restless that they killed some cattle that belonged to the padres." End quote. One irate missionary reported, quote, "And the ministers are heartbroken to see that the indigenous people are losing respect, and many not attend church, as it is their obligation." End quote. At the same time, the Jesuit fathers attempted to discredit the principal leaders of the anti-slavery crusade, and in the providence, the projector de Incendio, Francisco Lequin, by questioning his motives. The Society of Jesus had previously accused him of living in concubinage with indigenous women. The dominant opinion among the Jesuits was the Lequin was no beacon of freedom, but an opportunist who, on learning of his impending imprisonment on the account of his concubinage, had latched into an anti-slavery cause to strike back at the Society of Jesus. Soon enough, the series of accusations and the counter accusations made their way to the hacienda of Guadalajara, and the addition of the Jesuits of Sinaloa, the military commander, and other prominent residents closed ranks against the crusade. Herrera y Monterrey, can't say his name, struggled to keep the campaign alive. But in the end, the opposing coalition proved much too strong in Sinaloa. The anti-slave crusade also affected the notorious traffic of New Mexican indigenous peoples to the silver mines. Slavers engaged in this trade were so active and brazen that in the 1650s and 1660s, they had actually used a royal carriage meant to keep New Mexico supplied with manufactured goods and foodstuffs to transport their captives in complete and even mocking disregarded of the royal regulation. From time to time, colonial authorities in Parel and elsewhere cracked down on such activities. For instance, in 1662, the governor resided in Parel on learning of the impending arrival of 120 New Mexican slaves, posted notice forbidden to buy or selling of indigenous peoples, according to the royal orders, the wishes of His Majesty, end quote. Any offender risked losing his slaves. When the indigenous people finally arrived in Parel, the governor had brought out to the central plaza, a plain view of everyone, and with the help of an interpreter, he told them that they were free to go wherever they wish and could not be bought or sold by anyone. And it must have been a perplexing moment for both the slaves and the slaveholders. These early crackdowns failed to stop the indigenous slave trade, however. Residents continued to buy indigenous clandestinely, and slavers continued to supply them. But the Crusades certainly made life more difficult for traffickers. Shortly after this episode of Perel, Juan Manso, a former governor of New Mexico and a prominent trafficker, found himself on the road leading a caravan with more than 70 indigenous captives, heading to the town of San Juan Bautista in the province of Sonora. Manso sought to prepare the grounds by writing to the alcalde, who happened to be an old acquaintance of his, reportedly asking, quote, as a friend, to receive permission to enter the town to sell the indigenous peoples, and as a reward, he would deliver to the alcalde 2 of the 3 pieces. The alcalde refused. Manso and his colleagues found similar problems elsewhere in the mining town of San Miguel, and they had to contend with Fray Lorenzo del Aguilera, an affair known as preaching that indigenous slavery was, quote, a grave sin, end quote, or for refusing entrance to the church to anyone connected with the traffic of indigenous people, particularly, quote, the man from New Mexico who sold the indigenous peoples. Queen Marina and her ministers were outraged when they discovered that the royal carriage had been used to carry New Mexican indigenous people to the mining centers via the hacienda, the Adiacen, and the Guadalajara, and tireless Herrera y Monteros. Sorry, everybody. The Queen ordered that all slave owners of Nueva Leon, Nueva Vizcaya, and New Mexico relinquished their indigenous peoples within 3 days. Slaveholders released 202 indigenous slaves in Perel and 72 in Zacatecas, and they promised to release more in the future. The Queen's order also brought down a number of indigenous slaves exported from New Mexico. Although the Spanish campaign garnered some successes in places such as Trinidad and northern Mexico, it also underscored a very real limitations of monarchical authority. It worked in places where determined officials such as Governor Rotata and Audiencia member Herrera y Monteros held the royal decree. However, in many areas of the empire, the very officials charged with freeing the indigenous people were also in collision with the slavers. In Chile, where slavery had been legal between 1608 and 1674, the link between crown officials and slavers were extremely close. So close that royal and ecclesiastical authorities had become the very granators of the slave market. In the southern town of Concepcion, for example, the Jesuit named Pedro de Soto was a man in charge of examining the captives brought into town to determine whether they could be legally enslaved. On December 30th, 1668, a raiding party rode into Concepcion and presented its human cargo, including a 20-year-old woman named Kayapu and her baby son. Father de Soto pronounced the captives, quote, lawfully enslaved, and issued, quote, the usual certification. A few weeks later, Governor Bernardo del Manolio Cortez, residing in Valdeviva, issued a second certification declaring Kayapu to be a slave in oh my gosh, let me look up this word. Let me get it. No, not there. Here. All right, right back. I'm gonna check out this word, everybody. It's perpetuity, everybody. Sorry about that. Perpetuity. And her son to be a subject to, oh my gosh, temporary enslavement until turning 20, at which time he would be set free. There was nothing unusual about this certification. Quite the opposite. Their formulaic, business-like tone makes clear that they circulate widely, setting aside the possible kickbacks implied in these documents. I could find no evidence that Father De Soto or Governor Melanio Cortez received any fees for their certifications, sorry. Although it is likely that they were somehow compensated for their time and effort, they reveal the absolute complicity of religious and civil authorities in the traffic of indigenous people. Such was the state of affairs when Queen Marina proscribed all forms of native enslavement in Chile on December 20th, 1674. Understandably, Governor Juan Enriquez remained unmoved. In an unusually frank letter to the king, Enriquez wrote that the royal order posed great inconvenience to the owners, depriving them of their slaves and cheating them out of quote, the great sum of money, end quote, they had spent acquiring them. For instance, the decree directed slave owners to seek compensation for their lost property from the sellers. The governor found this provision entirely counterproductive, as it would give rise to, quote, a seedbed of lawsuits and unrest, end quote, all of which would be futile, because in the end, quote, the indigenous peoples and the soldiers who took the slaves, end quote, would be held accountable, and they, quote, did not have property with which to pay, end quote. But the governor's most serious objection was over security. His reasoned that since there were, quote, many more slaves than Spaniards, end quote, the entire province would be in grave peril. Quote, having set them free, they could convene gathers and conspire with the natural hatred that they possess towards the Spaniards, and our enemies would derive such an overwhelming advantage that it would lead to our total ruin. Governor Enriquez added sententiously that, quote, the fields will remain fallowed and the colonialists will not be able to sustain themselves, nor will the ecclesiastic derive their rents and tithes, and everything will collapse, and together with the honor of the enemy and the extreme need and poverty will compel everyone to leave. The tenor of the government's letter was defiant, but it was consistent with the medieval legal traditions that can be summed up in the curious dictum, I obey but do not comply. In the vast empire such as Spain, royal officials used this response to show both their respect for the royal authority and the incapability of the decree or order to particular kingdom. Governor Enrique used every means of at his disposal to avoid compliance. He delayed many public and making public the abolition decree. In 1674, when the Hacienda, the Audiencia of Santiago required Enriquez to follow through, he responded that, quote, it was up to him when to publish and to explain the said decree. Added that as a governor and captain general of Chile, he was responsible for the security of the kingdom, which had already been threatened by rumors that had promoted some slaves to flee. In the meantime, the governor put in practice that seemed to him a more promising strategy. He ordered all the owners to register their natives, who would no longer be called quote-unquote slaves, but would merely be held in, quote, in deposit. The member of the Haciendas of Santiago believed that this change would render the abolition decree completely ineffectual. Quote, because the indigenous people thus deposited would remain with their masters and owners in the same terms as before, and even worse, because they no longer would have access to the hacienda. I can't say it. In his 1679 comprehensive ban of all indigenous slaves in the hemisphere, Charles II recounted how much his mother had done on behalf of the indigenous of Chile, and specifically stated that, notwithstanding the argument advanced by Governor Enrique, he must set the indigenous peoples free. The governor refused even then. He clung to the belief that freeing the slaves was tantamount to losing Chile, a kingdom that had been ravaged by a long war with the Mapuches, but that nonetheless was necessary to keep because it is adjacent to the Strait of Magellan, which is the best passage to the South Sea, the Pacific Ocean. The governor had taken the obedeco pero non compleo dectum as far as it could go. I have no idea what that means. And the indigenous slaves in Chile remained in limbo. The backlash against the campaign to free indigenous people was strong. In the Philippines, the Royal Order of June 12, 1679, specifying the, quote, non-native, the no native could be held as slaves under any circumstances, and that, quote, all indigenous enslaved up to now are hereby set free, as well as their children and descendants, end quote. Caused a great deal of turmoil in Manila. As in Chile, the first recourse in the Philippines was to stall using their traditional formula. The Caudillo's royal order is of the kind that must be obeyed but not complied with. Observed the members of the Hacienda in Manila, quote, and we must write back to the prince so that better informed he could send us his orders, end quote. Their displeasure was patent, quote, when royal orders are so far apart from the natural law, they cannot be executed, end quote, wrote an irate Hacienda member of Charles II, quote, and with all due respect, even less so when that natural law is for the benefit of those who have been vanquished in war, for the victors would have the right to take their lives, but only choose to take away their liberties. Real quick, I'm gonna look ahead. 131. Remember 131, everybody. 131. All right, we're gonna read all the way, so we're gonna go a little bit over. We're gonna be halfway done. 131. There we are. All right, here we go. Yet even in the distant Philippines, there are some courageous crusaders. While awaiting for the king's reply, the Hacienda, the Audiencia attorney prodded his reluctant colleagues to make public an the Emancipation Decree. The immediate result was a flood of requests. Quote, so many were the slaves who crowded around this royal hacienda, Audiencia, to claim their liberty that we could not process the multitude of their papers, even when being extracted to brief and summarily. Many slaves around the capital abandoned their masters, who were left, quote, without service, end quote. As the Archbishop of Manila, Felipe Pedro, observed, it was in this province that the situation became truly crucial. Native Filipinos faced total ruin as they had most of their wealth invested in their slaves. Moreover, the slaves supplied much of the rice and other basic foodstuffs of the island, and now, agitated and encouraged by the recent laws setting them free, they went to the extremity of refusing to plant the fields, end quote. The greatest threat of all was that, quote, by setting these slaves free, the provinces remote from Manila may be stirred up, and revolt, such as those in the Vallasa and Nueva Sangova, and in the island of Mandano, in the malcontent Cargas, and Sambanos, might well join forces with the Muslims insurgents there. In Chile, the governor had taken the lead of opposing the Spanish campaign, but in the Philippines, all branches of the imperial administration, including the governor, the members of the Audiencia, and the city council of Manila, members of the military, and the ecclesiastical establishment, beginning with the archbishops, sent letters to Charles II requesting the suspension of the Emancipation Decree. Among the petitioners were native Filipinos for whom slavery had been a way of life since time immemorial. Quote, when a principal native walks around town or visits a temple, end quote, observed a Spanish chronicler, quote, it is with great pomp and accompanied by male and female slaves carrying silk parasols to protect their masters from the sun or rain. The senoras go first, following by their servants and slaves, and then come their husbands or fathers or brothers with their own servants and slaves, end quote. The Emancipation Decree came as a great annoyance to these native slave owners, those of Pamanga, Pampanga, a province on the northern shore of Manila Bay, in the central Luzon, resolutely imposed the liberation of their slaves, whom they regarded as, quote, the principal nerve and backbone of our strength. They wrote a long letter to the King of Spain, explaining how the Spanish Gillons were built in a nearby shipyard of Cavite with teak and Menhongi supplies in part by slaves, quote, and while our women together with our slaves plant the seeds, when we men are up in the hills cutting wood for the royal yards. By emancipating the slaves of Penmangas, the empire stood to lose its ships. In the end, the oh my gosh, I can't say this word. The Audiencia of Manila rescinded the King's Emancipation Decree on September 7th, 1682, and replaced it with a new decree All previously liberated slaves had to return to their duties within 15 days upon penalty of 100 lashings and 1 year of in the galleys. Forced service as a rower abroad, a galley or ship. Charles II continued to press his case of liberation, but ended formal slavery in the Philippines proved very difficult. The Spanish campaign washed over the frontier of the empire in the closing decades of the 17th century, but it followed such different trajectories that
What's the second point?
what I have not that many pages to the end of the chapter. That assessing its overall impacts, it is daunting, as were the goals of the campaign itself. Most tangibly, it brought a freedom to a few thousand native slaves out of some 300,000 to 600,000 in Trinidad, northern Mexico, and even Chile and the Philippines. Slave owners felt compelled to free some of their slaves. Yet these freedmen constituted but a fraction of the total number of native slaves in the empire. The Crusades thus brought into sharp relief the limits of the monarchical power, especially in distant lands and backwaters. The Crusades also had a chilling effect on European slavers. For all of his reluctance to free the slaves, Governor Enriquez of Chile did issue orders prohibiting soldiers from launching slave raids and taking indigenous captives after 1676. In the Philippines, where the pro-slavery coalitions had proved much too strong and had defied royal orders, the Audiencia of Manila nonetheless agreed to suspend for the period of 10 years the enslavement of the Filipino natives who were in the habit of hiding from Spanish authorities. The monarch's newfound determination to prosecute and punish slavers surely made their work much riskier. The Spanish campaign also pushed the slave trade further into the hands of native intermediaries and traffickers, rather in northern Mexico, Chile, or the Anones of Colombia and Venezuela. The crown had some power over Spanish slavers and authorities, but its control over indigenous slavers had extremely tenuous and non-existent. Late 17th and early 18th centuries witnesses the emergence of powerful indigenous polities that gained control of trade. The Carib indigenous people consolidated their position in the Illinois as the preeminent suppliers of slaves to taking period of empire building. Let's see here. Yep, one more page left. Another unanticipated result of the anti-slavery crusade was that it raised the expectation of indigenous peoples throughout the empire, which in the vast majority of cases remain unmet. Their experiences of the campaign was marked by dashed hopes, anxiety, and ruthlessness. In some instances, an uncertainty and turmoil culminated in major insurrections as the Pueblo Revolt in 1680 in New Mexico. Although the Spanish campaign often fell short of its stated goals, it foreshadowed further abolitionist movements in that the former slaves were worse off than before. Similarly, at the conclusion of the American Civil War, Congress passed the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, granting freedom to all slaves within the nation. The subsequent decades, however, witnessed the rise of draconian codes in some states aimed at restricting the rights of African Americans, as well as enforcing a labor practice that amounted to involuntary servitude. As with the Spanish campaign, these grand emancipation declarations delivered less than they promised. Yet the alchemical ingredients of emancipation were in the air during the closing decades of the 17th century, right at the time when Spanish campaign was gaining momentum. In 1671 to 1672, the Lord Proprietors of the English Carolina colony ordered that, quote, no indigenous people upon any occasion or pretext, however, is to be made a slave or without his own consent to carry out of Carolina. It is unclear whether the proprietors derived some inspiration from the Spanish monarchs, but their pronouncements shows that the ideal of indigenous emancipation was circulating widely in the Americas. Other precautious abolitionists of the era included Francis Daniel Pastores, a Quaker from Germantown, Pennsylvania, based on the biblical abomination. Quote, do unto others as you would have do unto you, end quote. The Pastores protested against African slavery in 1688, and urged his contemporaries to avoid discriminating against others, making, quote, no differences of what generation's descent or color they are, end quote. In the 1700s, Samuel Sewell, a Boston judge, published an anti-slavery tract that offered incentives, rebuttals of the remain arguments traditionally used to justify the enslavement of Africans. Elfanano del Moranas, a French Capuchin missionary living in Havana, probably came closest than anyone else in the 17th century to understanding that indigenous slavery and African slavery were two sides of the same coin. Europeans, quote, seized the land of natives of the Indies once they have killed them or enslaved them, he wrote in a just defense of the natural freedom of slaves in 1682, and they also expel black people from their own lands and reduce them to perpetual slavery, and someone shipped to America to transport to Europe. There we go. That's the end. We'll start on chapter 6, the greatest insurrection against the other slavery. And that is 135. What's up, Joe? I just wanted to finish. I had 2.5 pages to go.
Yeah, I thought that was the natural ending spot. Sorry.
No, it was chapter 6 is the natural ending spot. Would you like to say something?
It's a really good read, and I really enjoyed it. And I learned a lot about how the monarchies tried to end slavery, but they just didn't listen.
Mm-hmm. And that the monarchy power was basically not a full emancipation and left behind a lot of things, because I don't think the monarchs knew what that meant and what that means. I don't think they understood what needs to happen. You know what I mean? Like, they should have sent more people over to make sure that those things were happening, in my opinion.
So it was a really good read.
Yeah, it was. Does anybody else want to say something or want to come up and say anything? Question, critiques, things that they liked? You're welcome to come up if you want to.
Dude, read your question.
Go ahead, Dooley. You're still muted. Oh, Dooley's still loading?
Hello.
Hey.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Am Am I hearable? Okay.
Yes.
I just wanted to say, I just wanted to say that the more I learn about like history of America, the more I realize that it wasn't a like I already knew this, but God, this really reinforces that the quote unquote American Revolutionary War was literally just the same stuff as the American Civil War, just on a larger scale.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say that, yeah. I'd say that indigenous history is the history of the United States, and black history is also the history of the United States. You know? Many resistance and stuff like that. So yeah, it's disgusting. It's just the same thing over and over again, rebranded and repasted, just with a different set of peoples. Set of white peoples, that is. Oh yeah. All right. Is there anything else?
Hurry.
Dudley?
No.
All right, then. If no one else has anything else, I'll go ahead and close it out. Appreciate everybody for gifting as much as they could and for being here. We will continue tomorrow. The greatest insurrection against the other slavery. We're going to talk about the Pueblo indigenous people of New Mexico, it looks like. All right. All right, then.
Sounds good.